15 years prior to the controversial cancellation of the BAC-311, the seeds of what would ultimately become the sacrifice of Britain's aircraft industry were sown with the Vickers VC7 and V-1000, a pair of jet-powered military and passenger models that were to be the most advanced jet transport aircraft to fly during their time. Having illustrated many distinct advantages over the emerging rivals of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8, the Vickers VC7 and V-1000 gave the American giants cause for fear, as they won over prospective orders from the United States and even demanded alterations to their own designs in order to remain competitive with the British tour de force. Unfortunately, with the VC7 and V-1000 set to beat the 707 into the air by nearly a year, and with the prototype 80% completed, political factors conspired against this promising machine, and would culminate in what was considered by many observers as the point where Britain surrendered its place atop the higher echelons of commercial aircraft building, the cancellation of the BAC-311 and its many kin being a natural outcome of this pervasive mindset of managed decline. In 1950, the British aircraft industry led the way in terms of airliner innovation, with the Vickers Viscount having delivered the world's first commercial turboprop model that proved to be a huge success across the globe, including the highly insular American market, while the de Havilland Comet pioneered jet aviation into the passenger scene, beginning operations from 1952 on long-distance Empire routes for the British Overseas Airways Corporation or BOAC. Both the Viscount and the Comet had been conceived under the Wartime Brabazon Committee, a far-reaching strategy to ensure the British aircraft industry remained competitive on the commercial market following the end of World War II, and would deliver models across various individual sectors of the market so as to combat the powerhouse of the American economic machine. Such innovation wasn't just restricted to commercial aviation, as in military circles, Britain also poured great investment into new models for the RAF and Royal Navy so as to combat the emerging threat of Soviet aggression, with the English Electric Canberra becoming perhaps the world's first truly successful jet bomber, marrying speed and agility with payload to create a deadly combination on the battlefield. The Canberra was soon followed by the V-Force, Britain's initial nuclear deterrent, and one that placed speed over payload when it came to the delivery of atomic weapons into combat, a contrast to the American strategy of aircraft like the Boeing B-47 and B-52, which required a fighter escort when operating into enemy territory. The V-Force would ultimately emerge as the Avro Vulcan, the Handley Page Victor, and the Vickers Valiant, three aircraft that would fly at speeds approaching the sound barrier, and thus be capable of outrunning contemporary anti-aircraft weapons and Soviet interceptors, prior to unleashing its nuclear armament upon strategic targets deep behind enemy lines. Of the three models, the Avro Vulcan and Vickers Valiant demonstrated the most notable performance, while the Handley Page Victor was not as successful and saw fewer examples built, the initial praise garnered by the Valiant giving Vickers the incentive to adapt their pioneering jet model for other potential uses following its first flight in May 1951. In October 1952, the Ministry of Supply formally released Air Specification C-132D, which required the delivery of a jet-powered transport that matched the speed of the V-bombers and would support the V-Force, with various aircraft-building firms stepping up to the challenge, including Handley Page, who offered the HP-97, which featured a two-level layout that moved the passenger seating above the wing of a design otherwise almost identical to the Victor. The Handley Page proposal, however, was not held in favour by BOAC as a potential commercial byproduct of the C-132D military specification requirement, which thus led to the development of the highly modified HP-111, which was of a similar design to the HP-97 but included a modern six-abreast single-deck fuselage. Similarly, Avro proposed a transport variant of their Vulcan, which came to pass as the tailless delta-winged Avro Atlantic, also known as the Type 722, the model being designed specifically for the transatlantic route and would provide good takeoff performance without the need for flaps or slats as required by conventional wings, while also offering a high cruising speed and either 4 or 6 abreast seating, with the added oddity that the seats face to the rear of the aircraft. Vickers, meanwhile, created what was initially dubbed the VC5, which was essentially a slightly stretched Valiant bomber with windows, the model retaining the Valiant's shoulder-mounted wing, which would have left many rows windowless, while also requiring the use of long landing gear that BOAC considered unsuitable. The VC5, however, was something of a carryover from the original development of the Valiant during the late 1940s, and was never considered a complete aircraft package, the proposal quickly being dropped in favour of a more advanced submission by Vickers dubbed the VC7, which provided a larger 12-foot 6-inch fuselage with 6 abreast seating for 131 passengers, while the wings were relocated to a low-mounted position. Furthermore, slotted flaps were now incorporated, and the overall size of the wing was increased so as to present greater short-field performance, the intention being that the VC7 would be capable of operating both the prestigious North Atlantic run to Canada and the United States, but would also be suitable for operations on empire routes to the colonies of Africa and Asia, where good hot and high abilities were essential at many airports. In January 1953, Vickers received an order for the production of a flight-capable prototype, later given the serial number X-Ray Delta 662, along with a structural test frame, followed in March of the same year by the announcement that Vickers had won the Ministry of Supply specification requirement. Come June 1954, the Secretary of State for Air, William Sidney, declared that a production order for the military variant, designated as the V-1000, was to be placed for the RAF, though it became rapidly apparent to Vickers that creating an RAF transport version of the VC7 would be more complex than simply converting the initial design of the 1952 specification, while also stretching the limited experience of jet aircraft development in the UK aviation industry to its furthest extents. The RAF requirements for the V-1000 necessitated the use of double-slotted flaps to achieve optimal short-field performance for use across the British Empire, where many bases comprised improvised runways, while a sizable rear-mounted hydraulic freight elevator for self-loading operations also had to be integrated due to a common lack of suitable infrastructure and equipment at colonial airfields. While the VC7 shared many external aesthetic similarities to the earlier de Havilland Comet, the overall design was substantially larger and more advanced than before, requiring the extensive use of wind tunnels to cover short-field operations in addition to high-speed cruising flight, compounded further by the fact that development of structural and system demands took Vickers into uncharted fields of technology. In the end, the resultant airframe of the V-1000 was enlarged beyond what was expected for the Ministry of Supply specification, this being done to ensure maximum commonality between the VC7 and V-1000, such as a shared airframe for both the civil and military variants. Eventually, the general design underpinnings of the VC7 was for an all-metal conventional monoplane construction that was visually similar to the Comet, with the outer wing, which housed integral fuel tanks on the VC7 and flexible fuel bags on the V-1000, being swept at 28 degrees, while the leading edge of the inner wing, where the engines and air intake were located, was much more highly swept at 38 degrees. The engines, buried within the wings, were placed further outboard than the preceding Comet to reduce cabin noise and to avoid the rear fuselage encountering jet blast, while pod-mounted engines were avoided as a means of reducing potential debris ingress at improvised runways at colonial airfields. Finally, while the fuselage section looked similar to other narrow-body airliners, albeit with a more rounded ogive-shaped nose, similar to the Comet and the derivative Sud Aviation Caravelle, the V-1000 and VC7 were both designed for a 6-abreast layout, and thus had a much larger diameter than the Comet, presenting capacity that far outstripped the largest equivalent piston-powered and early turboprop models. The fuselage section itself consisted of a stringer skin structure supported by large numbers of light-section frames, which were attached to Z-section stringers that were in turn riveted to the skin, while a semicircular spine-like reinforcing beam would traverse the full length of the fuselage for strength and to stiffen the structure, allowing the entirety of the fuselage to be pressurized, including the 2 underfloor cargo holds. In the wake of the Comet disasters of 1954, the initial proposal for panoramic square windows was succeeded by 18 semicircular windows as per the Vickers Viscount, and would be set into the fuselage along with the front and rear entrance doors, while access to the aircraft would be made through 4 passenger exits and 2 overwing emergency exits. The linchpin of the entire VC7 and V-1000 scheme, though, would be its choice of power plants, the Rolls-Royce Avon turbojet engines, as employed on the Vickers Valiant, being discounted early on due to their severe fuel consumption, the Vickers designers being determined to ensure that their upcoming model would be as competitive as possible with both traditional piston-powered airliners and turboprops like the upcoming Bristol Britannia. Therefore, the VC7 and V-1000 would adopt the Rolls-Royce Conway engine, the world's first turbofan power plant that had been run on the bench for the first time during 1950, the Conway illustrating a far better fuel consumption while not sacrificing on power, presenting a thrust output of 13,000 pounds. This would be supported during takeoff by a water methanol boost injection, of which the aircraft was to carry 550 gallons within the inner wing groups. This facet, in combination with the enlarged wing and various high-lift devices, such as the curved Cushman-style wingtips, meaning the airliner was capable of the most optimal hot and high performance of any jet model at the time. Meanwhile, the flying controls of the wing consisted of multiple flaps, the inner set of which being single-slotted, while the outer pair were double-slotted two-section independently operated ailerons, both of which were supported by multi-section dive brakes set across various locations of the upper and lower wing surfaces. The tail surfaces, on the other hand, were conventional and adopted a similar shape to that used for the wing, the tail planes themselves employing a pronounced dihedral to keep them clear of the jet exhaust, while the elevators were split into 4 separate sections and the rudder was divided into 3 separately controlled pieces. For flight operation, the Vickers V-1000 would be provided 5 crew positions in the cockpit, a pair of pilots, a flight engineer, navigator and signaller, and the cabin would incorporate 6 abreast seating for 120 troops in a rear-facing configuration, while the VC7 passenger airliner would adopt 3 positions for 2 pilots and a flight engineer, and would present a maximum range of 4,100 miles, while being capable of carrying 131 passengers at a cruising speed of 520 miles an hour. Construction of the prototype was performed at the Vickers facility of Wisley Airfield in Surrey, which would also be the home of its flight trials following its expected rollout during the spring of 1957, the airframe, by November 1956, having been 80% completed and had seen a total of £4 million spent on the project. By contrast, the main competitor to the VC7 in terms of passenger models was the Boeing 707, that had the advantage of being directly descended from the already proven Boeing 367-80 prototype of 1954, which had been delivered initially as a proof of concept for a US Air Force refueling tanker requirement that would eventually lead to the development of the KC-135, of which a passenger derivative was spun to create the 707. However, the rapid development of the VC7 gave Boeing cause for concern, as with the project having reached 80% completion by the end of 1956, the expectation was that the British airliner would conduct its maiden flight several months before the 707, and subsequently enter passenger service from early 1958, while the V-1000 would make its debut in military operations from 1959. The design of the VC7 was another worry for both Boeing and Douglas, the latter of whom was in the early stages of developing their pioneer jet model in the form of the DC-8, the 6 abreast seating configuration of the Vickers model, far outstripping the 4 abreast configuration of the original 707 proposal, thus demanding their increase in the width of the fuselage to accommodate 5 abreast seating. At the same time, the wing design offered a number of advanced features and an increased wing area that greatly reduced the length of the takeoff run, thus opening up a wider selection of airports to the VC7 while not compromising its potential range, these many elements catching the attention of prestigious carriers in the United States, including Pan Am and American Airlines. With Boeing and Douglas afraid of losing the attention of these important customers, the Boeing 707 was modified again to accommodate 6 abreast seating, this move reigniting interest in the American models, and orders began to flow in for the 707 once its revised design had been reintroduced onto the market, though the VC7 still maintained better range thanks to the Conway engines and a distinct time advantage over the Americans. However, though the VC7 project was moving enthusiastically forward, the V-1000 was starting to lose its political support by mid-1956, mainly due to the fact that its all-up weight of £248,000 far exceeded its original £230,000 forecast, negatively impacting the aircraft's performance, while the air staff were highly conscious of the fact that the V-1000, together with other prospective military projects, were running heavily over budget. Under pressure from the British Treasury, cutbacks needed to be made, with the V-1000 being highlighted as by far the most expensive project currently undergoing development. Thus the Air Staff opted to cancel the V-1000 in favour of more vital fighter schemes, with the leftover budget of the transport being reallocated to their creation. This was further supported by a change in strategic transport requirements by the Air Staff, who considered the delivery of an aircraft that matched the speed of the V-bomber force to be unnecessary, compounded by the contraction of the British Empire that reduced the domain of the V-force's extent to provide immediate support across the globe. Therefore, in November 1956, the Ministry of Supply announced their abandonment of the jet-powered strategic transport in favour of simply converting the Bristol Britannia Model 200 mixed freighter to a military configuration, the Britannia itself being a long-delayed project conceived under the original Brabazon Committee and would provide a long-range turboprop for a transatlantic market now saturated by superior jet airliner models. The choice of the Britannia as a successor transport model to the V-1000 was also politically motivated by a need to bolster employment in Northern Ireland, with the Short Brothers Company of Belfast having been left lacking in work following the premature cancellation of the Comet II airliner and the disastrous Supermarine Swift fighter, the outsourcing of assembly work for the Britannia to the Short plant being of the greatest political convenience when compared to continuing the V-1000 scheme. As for the VC7, the cancellation of its military brother cast shadows across the future of this scheme as well, with the Ministry of Supply stating that the future progression of a civilian version of the V-1000 was no longer necessary, as BOAC had no requirement for it, the national carrier having already committed itself to the heavily modified and enlarged Comet 4 that was scheduled for delivery in 1958. At the same time, BOAC was expected to take on a fleet of Bristol Britannias from 1957, much to the reluctance of the carrier, whose management deliberately highlighted minor flaws in the design as major concerns that required lengthy remediation, pushing back the release of this turboprop airliner to the point that it would ultimately be delivered less than a year prior to the Boeing 707, thus dooming its potential commercial performance. The VC7 still had its supporters, though, with Reginald Maudling, the Minister of Supply, considering that the airliner maintained an endemic value that had garnered the interest of other carriers, the most vocal of whom was TransCanada Airlines, whose president, Gordon McGregor, travelled to London to lobby in favour of the project following its announced cancellation in November 1956. BOAC, though, remained unenthused by the project, with Chairman Miles Thomas being conscious of the financial damage caused by the tragic Comet disasters, while at the same time having invested large sums of money into the development of the Comet 4 as a means of restarting their jet operations at the first opportunity. While Thomas was willing to allow Vickers the opportunity to update the VC7 specifications, the results of these amendments were not enough to sway him back in favour of the machine, and thus the BOAC chairman formally announced that the British national carrier would not take on the VC7, with the publicly stated reason being due to its weight increases impacting its performance, though the reality was simply down to his reluctance to support another British aircraft programme alongside his own existing commitments. The Conway engine was a particular bone of contention for BOAC, as this power plant was still under development at the time and thus not fully proven in flight, while another detracting claim against the VC7 was that the enclosed engines in the wing would be unable to accept higher-powered fan engines, despite the fact that implementing higher-powered units had been successfully conducted for the similarly designed Victor bomber. Regardless, Thomas's decision was final, with BOAC declaring that they would be happy to utilise the Britannia from 1957 as an interim measure until the Comet 4 could be delivered in 1958, the airline's insistence on not seeing the VC7 forward to completion, despite being so close to the end, leaving Maudling no choice but to concede defeat, and finally wrap up the project by the end of 1956. In reality, the cancellation of the VC7 would be a costly blow for BOAC against the prestige of its rivals, as the Comet 4, which was finally delivered in September 1958, proved to be a very outdated design when compared to the Boeing 707 that entered service with Pan Am a month later, while the Bristol Britannias, which had been designed for long-term use, only saw fleeting service with the carrier from their introduction in 1957 to their withdrawal in 1966. The Comet 4s, as delivered, could only accommodate 48 seats, the overarching mindset of the BOAC management being something of a carryover from the late 1940s, that air travel was simply a luxury for the most affluent customers, while the Boeing 707, widened and modified to compete with the VC7, could carry 137 passengers in its smallest two-class configuration, thus yielding a far greater cost-per-seat-mile ratio. Ultimately, the Comet 4 was internally rearranged to carry up to 81 passengers, but this was still not enough to combat the 707 on even terms, especially when considering that the airliner was unable to fly the North Atlantic route between London and New York without requiring a fuel stop at Gander in Newfoundland, Canada. This led inevitably to BOAC abandoning the Comet 4 in favour of the Boeing 707, cancelling their final orders of the type, as well as a prospective advanced variant of the machine dubbed the Comet 5, the British flag carrier instead investing £44 million into a clutch of 15 Boeing 707-400s fitted with Rolls-Royce Conway engines that were delivered in 1960, the last BOAC Comet flights across the Atlantic taking place during the same year, while the final examples of the type saw out their days on sundry other duties until 1969. As for the wider cancellation of the VC7, this caused a major stir in the British political class, with many seeing its discontinuation, especially in consideration of its progress and £4 million cost to that date, as an almost criminal act of surrendering the future of commercial aviation development to the United States. In far-sighted and prescient statements to the House of Commons, ministers such as John Peyton, MP for Yeovil, and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party George Brown accurately predicted that, with Boeing and Douglas so far ahead in the development of jet airliners, Britain would have no possibility to create a competitive, independent jet-powered commercial aircraft in the future, or at least one that would be able to take a proportional share of the market from its American rivals. In response to these criticisms, Minister of Supply Reginald Bordling considered that due to the increase in the airliner's weight and the inability for Rolls-Royce to provide a power plant to suitably compensate for this downturn in performance, had caused any potential customers to lose interest, and that the VC7 had not the commercial forecast to justify pushing it through to completion. Maudling's explanation was subsequently shot down by various figures in both Parliament and the wider industry, with Paul Williams, MP for Sunderland South, stating that while the weight had indeed increased, Rolls-Royce had already addressed this concern by improving the power of the Conway engines, Williams also noting that the aircraft had a built-in margin of safety due to its larger wing, and that commercial interest was still apparent in the form of TCA's ultimately futile lobbying during late 1956. Regardless, the matter as to restarting the VC7 and V-1000 would continue to plague Parliament up to the end of 1957, with the topic still being hotly debated in the Commons following the first flight of the Boeing 707 in December of that year, the general consensus being that Britain had essentially given up commercial aircraft development to the Americans, and the technological lead once proudly held by the UK industry was now firmly in the hands of Boeing and Douglas. As the 707 and later DC-8 swept the global market for long-range commercial airliners, Britain attempted a comeback with the Vickers VC10 during the early 1960s, another highly advanced proposal that carried over many aspects from the VC7, including its wing design and use of Cushman-style wingtips that allowed for superior hot and high performance. However, what the machine made up for in technological supremacy, it lacked in efficiency and ease of maintenance, factors that caused BOAC, as the prospective launch customer, to immediately reject the model, only for strong-arming by the government to see them initially procure the expected break-even quantity for the project of 80 units, before eventually settling on 15 standard and 35 Super VC10s, with the remaining order being made up of additional Boeing 707s as a compromise. The VC10, though, would garner no widespread orders from across the industry, due to it being generally case-specific to the hot and high routes of the British Empire, and would ultimately see only 54 units delivered before production ended in 1970, with its main clientele being those carriers that benefited the most from its hot and high abilities, such as Gulf Air, East African Airways, and Middle East Airlines. In the longer term, Britain would partake in the pan-European Airbus collaboration during the late 1960s, but the UK government would eventually drop out, following a dispute over the dismissal of Rolls-Royce as the main engine provider, while at the same time BAC, as one of the two main civil aircraft manufacturers in Britain, proposed their own model of similar proportions in the form of the BAC 311. In what would become a three-way split between supporting the home-built BAC 311, the pan-European Airbus A300, or the comparatively low-cost minority role of the American Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, of which Rolls-Royce was to be the exclusive engine provider, the government opted to support the L-1011, not only sacrificing yet another promising British airliner design, but also removing any potential for the British state to have a major part of what would become the incredibly successful Airbus venture. Instead, the UK government would be left to bail out and nationalise Rolls-Royce following its disastrous development of the RB211 turbofan engine for the TriStar, the bankruptcy of Rolls-Royce in 1971, not only delaying the launch of the L-1011 against its closest rival, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, but also souring commercial confidence in the machine going forward, leading to a sales failure that never recouped its substantial development cost. Thus, by the 1980s, while the British government had regained a minor stake in the Airbus venture through its acquisition of Hawker Siddeley Aviation, thereby forming British Aerospace as the primary wing supplier for Airbus models, the UK commercial aircraft industry was facing a bleak future, punctuated by fleeting successes like the BAE Jetstream 31 and the 146 regional jet airliner. Eventually, in the 1990s, the final nail came when British Aerospace, now privatised, opted to abandon civil aircraft construction following the commercial failure of the Advanced Turboprop or ATP, the highly successful 125 business jet being sold on to Raytheon of America, while the Jetstream, ATP and 146 would gradually be removed from sales, the latter of which would become the very last British commercial airliner built when it was withdrawn from production in 2001. In summary, the Vickers VC7 and V-1000 is considered very much the beginning of the end for the British commercial aviation industry, as while there were many practical concerns, including the increase in weight for the model, these could easily have been accommodated through modifications to the Conway engines, while the overall concept presented a machine that in many ways far outstripped the original proposals of the American rivals, and demanded that they improve their own designs to match. Therefore, the dismissal of the VC7 and V-1000 in favour of the Comet 4 and the Britannia as simple, low-cost, short-term solutions proved to be a tragic misstep as to the long-term survival of Britain's ability to create independent airliners going into the late 1950s and early 1960s, as not only did it rob the market of a potentially superb aircraft, but was also the point where the UK government essentially surrendered the technological lead of the British to its rivals in the United States.